and they often died alone. Beyond the gruesome medical details, Thucydides' account holds interest because it documented the social conditions that surrounded the plague. The beginning of the war had also seen a movement of people from the countryside surrounding Athens into its city's walls, where thousands were crowded. So briefly, just to paint the picture a little bit, and here you can see from a 17th century Dutch painting, a kind of portrayal of the plague in Athens. What happened was that when Athens entered into the war with Sparta, it took all the people, all the farmers and residents of the countryside around the city walls. They were all urged to come into the city walls. And so there was a lot of crowding inside the city walls. And that's when the plague broke out. Thucydides observes that this crowding exacerbated the spread of the disease. This is so not merely because of the crowded housing conditions. So most of the farmers who were in the city walls were sort of invited to set up temporary housing kind of on the outskirts of the main city. But there was also a problem of poor sanitation that exacerbated the spread of the disease. Thucydides is also interested in the moral changes wrought by the plague. For instance, he notes that some displayed selflessness in nursing others to health. Others, however, became lawless, stealing property and disregarding funeral customs for burying the dead. As Thucydides says, quote, "For the violence of the calamity was such that men, not knowing where to turn, grew reckless of all law, human and divine." After the plague, Athens' appetite for war with Sparta was weakened, and the people of the city were angry with Pericles. In a speech that Pericles makes that following year, he urges the city to band together. In particular, he urges the people of the city to forget their individual suffering and to focus on the good of the city. And here I want to just read a section of that speech to you, and this is from Thucydides. As Pericles says, quote, "A man may be personally ever so well off, and yet if his country be ruined, he must be ruined with it. Whereas a flourishing commonwealth always affords chances of salvation to unfortunate individuals, it is surely the duty of everyone to be forward in her defense, and not, like you, to be so confounded with your domestic afflictions as to give up all thoughts of the common safety." Pericles notes, moreover, that if there is about Athenian policy in the war, it is a reflection of shamefully weak resolve on the part of the city's complainants. As he says, and I believe I have this as a quote for you as well, "The apparent error of my policy lies in the infirmity of your resolution, since the suffering that it entails is being felt by every one of you, while its advantage is still remote and obscure to all. And a great and sudden reverse having befallen you, your mind is too much depressed to persevere in your resolve. Cease then to grieve for your private afflictions and address yourself instead to the safety of the commonwealth." Note Pericles' reminder here that the suffering is felt equally across the people of Athens. That to feel as if you are suffering is to forget the rewards that lie at the end of perseverance for everyone. And that to feel as if you are suffering is to be mired excessively in your own distinct depression. And to focus on your suffering is to forget the safety of the commonwealth. Scholars who have remarked on what the Athenian plague narrative have to tell us today have found that it speaks to the dangerous vulnerability of democracy. So for example, Gary Bass, writing for the New Yorker in June 2020, claims that, quote, "millennia later, the plague reminds us that the legacy of the eternal wonder of Athens contains within it a cautionary tale. The failure of democratic society to cope with a lethal epidemic, the model of how democracy began, is also a study in how it can founder and fall. Similarly, Catherine Colonising, writing for The Atlantic, remarks that a pandemic damages a democracy's self-conception. She says, quote, "In the panic of the Great Plague, Athenians experienced something about their world that they could never purge and revealed something about themselves that they could never forget. The Great Plague tested the Athenian democratic self-conception and found it wanting. A democracy is unlikely to survive when people have grown unsure of themselves and their leaders, their laws, and their democratic institutions." These assessments of the Athenian plague's lesson valuably draw attention to the relationship between the pandemic and the strength of democratic institutions. However, in thinking of the question, are we all in this together? I believe there's a different lesson to draw from the Thucydides' plague narrative, a lesson about the rhetorical force of the call for unity during a time of crisis. As we see from Thucydides' plague narrative, the language of unity is moral language. Whoever mobilizes that language of unity says, in effect, put a care for the common good above your narrow interests. Whoever mobilizes it, therefore, leverages a moral argument about a moment of crisis, namely, now is not the time for you to think of yourself rather than the common good. Moreover, this moral argument is meant to be leveraged against complaints of those who suffer, as if to say, you ought to be ashamed to use this moment of crisis to make a case for narrow self-interest. We saw that Pericles mobilized this argument against those suffering in Athens. He accuses those complaining of putting narrow self-interest above the common good. Thucydides, too, mobilizes a version of this argument against those suffering in Athens. He describes the people who fear the plague as property raiders and moral degenerates, people whose darkest desires are let loose by the breakdown of law in their city, and who are willing to offend the gods by neglecting their funeral duties. There can be something insidious in this sort of argument, for it may be used to delegitimize legitimate complaint. The people crowded on the outskirts of the city who are lacking adequate sanitation and housing arguably had a legitimate complaint. When they stole property or neglected to bury their dead, it may have been out of real need or from real danger and not moral decrepitude, as both Pericles and Thucydides suggest. What interests me about Thucydides' plague narrative is that it states plainly what is meant by the call for unity. It states in particular an explicit moral argument that the common good must come first in a time of crisis, and that attention to one's own needs is selfish and shameful. I appreciate Thucydides' plague narrative because it lays that argument bare. By contrast, in our own time, the call for unity during a pandemic is what Plato might have called a fine speech. That is, a speech that conceals its full argument with fine-sounding rhetoric. For there is something I believe to be hidden in the way that we use the language of unity during the COVID pandemic. As noted earlier, the current calls for unity appear to be benign. What harm, after all, can there be in a Budweiser ad calling for unity, or a well-placed sign in a yard that is kindly meant? The example of Thucydides' plague narrative suggests that there is deeper work, I think, done by these apparently benign claims. I would suggest to you that the arguments of Pericles and Thucydides are not far behind the signs and advertisements that we are all in this together. These signs and advertisements may also be doing the work of shaming those who are making complaints, perhaps legitimate complaints. Therefore, I would urge you that when you hear these calls and see these signs, you would do well to see them in a historical context where they have done work to legitimize some moral arguments in a time of crisis and to delegitimize other, perhaps very legitimate complaints. Thank you. I'll pass it over now to Dr. Ammon.
It's always a pleasure to be on a panel or doing an event with Dr. Cremaldi. She is, I just love the way that she pulls her materials together, and it's very exciting to be here with you and her today to talk about this. My presentation is a little bit less about now and more about the past in a different way than Anna's was. And I think that, well, I hope that this will shed another kind of light on human behavior during a time of plague. So I too am about to share my screen. Give me a second here to get this going. Nope, that is not what I want. You'd think after a semester of doing this twice a week, I would be better at it. Okay, screen one. Hopefully you all see that. And yes, is it all visible? Okay, great, thank you. Okay. So I'm gonna talk for a little bit about this particular historical figure. His name is Bernardino de Sahagún, and he was a missionary to the New World. And he knew as New Spain, and that the indigenous of Mexico called Anahuac, and today we know as Central Mexico. He lived from 1499 to 1590, which is an impressive lifespan for the 15th and 16th century, and spent most of his life in what is now Mexico City. The 16th century is the first century of the European incursion into the Americas, and it was an apocalyptic societal upheaval for the indigenous people, as well as a momentous transformation of ideas about humanity from the perspective of both the Europeans and the indigenous people they encountered. The monk in this image, sitting in a library holding a book, is one of the most famous New World missionaries. He learned the indigenous language and, with the help of indigenous collaborators, collected a variety of information about Anahuac, its people, and customs. He did this, of course, in service of his Christian missionary work, though the volumes of information that he collected, known as the Florentine Codex, contain some of the best information scholars have about the world of Anahuac before Columbus. In addition to collecting information about flora, fauna, beliefs, and practices of the Aztecs and neighboring groups in Mesoamerica, Sahagún kept a record of current events. Through the 16th century, sickness was a constant presence. He wrote, in the year 1545, there was a very great and general plague in which the major portion of the people living in all this New Spain died. And at the time of this plague, I resided in the city of Mexico, and I buried more than 10,000 bodies. And at the conclusion of the plague, I contracted the sickness myself and was near death. His use of the term plague is generic. For Sahagún, it is the name of any disease that spreads quickly and kills most who contract it. Images from the Florentine Codex give hints of the context and appearance of this plague, and in this image of a sick person with many dots or pustules on their skin, we get a sense of at least some of the characteristics of the disease. The left corner shows a patient talking with an indigenous healer, and in other panels, patients are lying on pallets covered in blankets in positions conveying discomfort, a presentation of the disease. However, even with these pictures, we cannot be certain of which of the many possibilities this disease was. The Nawa word for disease is kokolitzli, which is usually translated as pestilence. The term first appeared in 1519. Regardless of the disease itself, it is attributed as the primary cause of deaths up to 80% of the indigenous population by 1545. It's not that there wasn't disease, and I'll talk some more about that in a second in the Aztec world, but that this particular disease had its own term for that is translated as pestilence. This is an image of Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec world at the time of the European invasion. It is a vast urban space with a large market, temples, a palace that is considerably smaller than the highest temples to the Aztec gods. People lived in communities outside of the main square, which were agricultural areas. The blue grid shows the aqueducts and river streets of the city. Its population in 1490 was somewhere between 200 and 400,000 inhabitants. And just for perspective, the largest city in Western Europe in 1490 was Naples, Italy, with 150,000 inhabitants, and Madrid, that contained 60,000 people, Sevilla, around 40,000. So Tenochtitlan is a major metropolis, in addition to being the heart of the Aztec Empire. So this is a map of the spread of the Aztec Empire, just so you have a sense of what that urban area is the center of. And this is about their spread up into the time of the invasion. So between 1427 and 1519, the Aztecs take over this whole portion of central Mexico. And the rulers of the empire did take their role to secure the safety of their empire quite seriously through ritual and public ceremonies, honoring deities, and expressing the might of the Aztec Empire. And of course, they had experienced disease, though not the diseases the European invaders brought with them. The Florentine Codex records advice given to Aztec rulers regarding what to do when facing a plague. The ruler is encouraged to govern with grace, to make no one weep, to mobilize the healers, and to do his part as a ruler to maintain morale and keep the city of Tenochtitlan and the Aztec Empire functioning. This entailed public prayer, comforting people personally through being visible and present in the city and at the temples, and supporting the work of healers. Most of the healers in Mesoamerican cultures were women, and this is an image of an Aztec woman with a speaking glyph next to her mouth. During an outbreak of the disease, Aztec monarchs governed through good public policy, supplication to the god of health and well-being, Tezcatlipoca, who's a very complicated deity figure, and the mobilization of healthcare workers. Regardless, these traditional methods did not save the inhabitants of Tenochtitlan from the diseases brought by Cortes and his conquistadors, diseases for which the indigenous people had no natural immunity or effective treatments. Europeans interpreted diseases and outbreaks of the plague, including the Black Death, to three different, sometimes overlapping causes: sin, the devil, or God. Disease was understood often as God's punishment for humanity's sins. Jewish people were often targets, seen as unredeemed sinners that had brought the plague by their very presence. Regardless of how many Jews were killed by the same disease as Christians, Jews were frequently blamed for God's wrath. Their sin was both rejecting Jesus as the Messiah and being understood as responsible for his death. Pogroms against Jews, poisoning their wells, burning their homes, driving them out of an area, were often Christian responses to plague. The image here depicts medieval Christians burning Jews in 1349, with several figures watching while others are adding fuel to the fire. These acts against Jews were instigated by flagellants, a group of Christians traveling from place to place, whipping themselves for their sins and the sins of humanity. Oh, I'm sorry, this one is a little out of frame. These processions of Christians, such as the one depicted in the image here of several people following flag bearers, would pray, sing, beat themselves with whips, traveling from city to town and through the countryside, publicly praying and performing acts of penance. They were actually what we would call super spreaders, and some of their contemporaries knew it too. Flagellants were often not welcomed and were eventually officially banned by the church hierarchy, yet they inspired acts of violence against Jews and other minority groups such as the Roma. The Black Death was not the first instance of Christian scapegoating of Jews, nor would it be the last, but it did release hatred, blame, and violence on a more horrific scale than by any pandemic in world history up to that point. Almost all scholars of the history of Christianity and Christian violence agree that the Black Death stands out as a kind of high violence marker for interreligious violence in European history. The question of whether plagues caused the increased violence is debated, even though there's this correspondence between the two. But very few question the role of pogroms against Jews in the 14th century as a response to the spread of the bubonic plague. But this focus on sinners as the cause of the plague ultimately translated into strict racial identities. There were sinful races, Jews and Muslims, who brought the plague upon the populace, and a saved race of European Christians that saw the rejection of salvation as the ultimate sin. For the Europeans who lived through the Black Death and who eventually would arrive in the New World, the concept of race was tightly connected to religious practices. God was understood as using the plague to punish people for various sins, such as tolerating Jews in their midst. On the other hand, one should not underestimate the role of the devil in these things. For the European Christian, the devil was omnipresent himself, working to undermine God's will, particularly during a plague. From bringing bad air to using human agents to perform his tasks, the devil was considered an active agent and a force of his own in the medieval and early modern world. In this Dürer woodcut, the devil as well as death are the constant companions of the Christian, here represented by the knight. These two ideas, one of divine punishment for human sinfulness and the role of the devil as a creature that desired worship and adoration that would lead human astrays or cause chaos in the human world, came together in the interpretation of the presence of such overwhelming disease and death in New Spain. Spaniards considered the indigenous people of Mexico in two conflicting ways, at least. First, they were not clearly identified with any peoples in the Bible, and therefore their humanity was the subject of some controversy. And in addition, the Aztecs performed many different kinds of sacrifices, including human sacrifice, which also provided justification for the conquest and slavery and demonstrated the clear hand of the devil. So the Europeans were doing a whole lot of work there. All for good, even though some of it was quite oppressive, obviously, and destructive. But on the other hand, these indigenous people, they were clearly, at least to some Spanish eyes, spiritual and considered by some of the early missionaries to be actually closer to God than Europeans. In this image, where two natives are dancing as an eagle, a symbol of the Aztec deity Huitzilopochtli to natives and a symbol of John the Evangelist to Christians, flies in the sky. A third native is playing an instrument, and they are accompanied by the sacred cactus in the top left corner, growing from a heartstone. And you might notice also that there's a little devil dragon creature present in the sky as well, possibly indicating the role of the devil in indigenous life before the arrival of Europeans. In the image below, two natives are carrying their harvest on their backs, following a path to the market. These images of pastoral, simple lives spoke of a sort of innocence that the Europeans, or at least some European missionaries, thought lost. And while it may have been a lifestyle tainted by the presence of God's constant adversary, it still showed an openness or a potential for a greater spiritual life than many Europeans themselves might have, with all of the decadence and sort of growing greed that is part of the 16th century. How then did Europeans make sense of the massive plague that overtook these people? On the one hand, the sacrifices made to the devil, which is how the Europeans interpreted Aztec gods, made the indigenous sinners, and therefore plague seemed a fitting punishment for their actions. Likewise, this same sinfulness justified the enslavement of indigenous people by Europeans. Sahagun wrote, quote, "The people are becoming extinct with great rapidity, not so much from the bad treatment accorded them," which, so acknowledging kind of the slavery and general oppression of the invasion, not so much from the bad treatment accorded them as the plagues God sends them. On the other hand, the missionaries went to work to try to remedy that sinfulness by rapidly converting the indigenous people, where at least some of the missionaries hoped the Christian God might preserve them in the face of this new and terrifying disease. European Christianity then became both the bringer of the disease and the promised cure. The image here of a procession of native converts to Christianity carrying a banner and followed by people in various forms of indigenous and European attire show a kind of attachment or a growth of the use of both indigenous images, which you can see in here and particularly at the bottom, and an incorporation of Christianity. The Aztecs were accustomed to adding new deities to their pantheon, particularly if they believed the strength and power of that divine being might enhance or expand their own power. So what lessons might this tragic history have for us? We see that COVID-19, or we hear that COVID-19 is an equal opportunity virus, though it does disproportionately affect people of color who work in service industries. Some have called it God's will. Some have seen it as a conspiracy perpetrated against Americans. Others have attributed to it the nefarious behavior of other races and ethnic groups, though it has ravaged those communities as ferociously as it has any other. I think we can glean from this historical exploration that disease, part of the human experience, often brings out our fears, ideas that are old and powerful and false. But more importantly, we can see the way that plague can be weaponized for ideological benefit and power of one group over another. In our day, there is a new player to answer questions about what leaders should do, how to treat the virus, how to limit its damaging effects, the scientific establishment. But we see how that can be easily pushed aside as humans jockey for advantage in the depth of fear that disease brings. Our choice, which the indigenous people of the Americas did not have, is to choose differently. Science and rationality over fear, human care and concern over hopes for miracles and divine intervention. Thank you.
Right. Well, if there are any questions, you could type your question in the chat, or we could try if you just speak out your question and see if that works. Laura, I know also that some of the Spaniards rationalized the difference in death rate between Spaniards and natives in the New World by thinking about the native body and the native diet, and how the European diet was clearly superior because the Spaniard was surviving in greater numbers, and that the European body was the white body that was fed by meat and wine and wheat, was thus better equipped for defense against disease than was the brown body that was largely vegetarian and root and insect eating. And I've wondered myself how that kind of embodying thinking might be rectified in this current pandemic. And already I've been seeing, explanations for why African Americans are dying in higher numbers. It always comes back to their bodies, that they've got more of this and less of that. And, when this whole genetic research era since the 1990s is really moving the cause of disease away from social history and public health into the body focused problem, and thus sort of exempting or ignoring public health and public health solutions and public health deficits. And so I've just been wondering what this current epidemic might be doing to racialize the body again. Either Anna or Laura or anybody else can react to that.
I do think that there's always been a tendency to blame to blame health problems on racial identity or racial cultures rather than to look at its economic location. And that this trend that you're talking about, I think, is really interesting about genetics, because it will also takes much of the blame for people getting sick falls on themselves, right? So when someone gets cancer but they smoked, it's kind of a sort of balancing act that some people do about the disease, rather than looking at certain kinds of socioeconomics. And I think that the genetic move is actually reworking that same situation. Now it's actually a little bit more out of the control of the individual, that if she or he or they get sick, but it still has some implications for individual responsibility. And you can hear that in what you were describing about how the Spaniards approached indigenous bodies, how they thought about weakness that's attributed to diet and skin color and location. You can hear that same kind of, it's really your bad choices that have landed you in this position rather than some more structural problem. And I think that might tie in to how Anna was talking about the use of rhetoric and what hides underneath the rhetoric of we're all in this together. But that's just.
I would add to, because this sort of got obscured by what I focused on in Thucydides, but Thucydides uses two words to talk about the plague. He uses the word gnosis and lemos. And these words actually, in particular lemos, appears in ancient Greek literature and science as it's in the places where we see this word pop up are, for example, in Homer, when Apollo visits a plague on the Athenians for their violation of divine law, right? So it's a divine visitation against a people's for some moral wrong that they've committed. Similarly, the other place where you see it is in Oedipus Rex, where, again, the plague is visited upon the people for a moral wrong that they have committed. So in listening to Laura talk, one of the things I'm really struck by is the way that we've been moralizing disease for a very, very, very long time. And I mean, we find ourselves even moralizing, I think, disease today, right? We do blame the people who have COVID for having it, right? We say that it's because of some poor diet or, you know, some individual choice that they've made such that they have this disease. It's very striking to me that this is such a insistent pattern in the way that we think about disease.
And oh, sorry, Phoebe.
Oh, Phoebe. Yes, Phoebe.
Can you hear? Am I muted?
No, we can hear you.
As a nurse, I have to say that some people are somewhat responsible. For instance, in COVID, if you refuse to wear a mask, refuse to social distance, and go to bars every night, you are more likely to get it. And I don't think that's moral. I think that's the facts. And if you smoke cigarettes, you are in fact way more likely to get lung cancer than if you don't smoke cigarettes. Good or bad, you know, I don't say that's a moral judgment. That's just a fact.
I do think that those facts then get used in moral judgments, and the COVID, particularly the issues that you raise about people who don't social distance or they won't wear masks, or in fact who are flagrantly acting against those things, reinforces the moral judgment that's kind of already there. So there are scientific facts, and then there's this little bit of sense of like, well, it didn't happen to me, but it did happen to you because you are a bad person, at least in the guise of COVID.
And I mean, I guess to add, Phoebe, right, you know, like even if we look at the way Thucydides talks about the plague, it's very striking that he acknowledges that there are public health issues at play in the spread of it, right? He says that overcrowding and poor sanitation are issues. But when it comes down to sort of identifying the locus of the blame for the problem, he really seems to come down on the side of blaming the behavior of the people in Athens, right? What are they doing personally, right? He doesn't discuss public health extensively as a cause of the problem. And it's just interesting where, you know, the focus, where the focus gets laid.
I guess there's maybe a difference between cause and blame, you know, causality. You can say these things lead to X. I mean, we have to as public health, you know, as a public health nurse, 40 years. If you do these things are likely to happen. If you do those things, these other things are likely to happen. But I can tell you as a nurse right now, a lot of hospital people are quitting. You know, we had 9 leave the hospital already, and more will, because so many of the people they're seeing with COVID right now, many are to blame. You know, they're not doing the public health, and nurses and doctors and nurses assistants and hospital janitors are putting their lives on the line and their families' lives on the line to help people who are not helping them in return by wearing masks and being distant, etc.
But Phoebe, I think you would agree with me, because we've talked about this before, that that a discussion of public health and the history of defunding public health in the United States has been strikingly absent from our discussion of the causes of the current pandemic.
Yeah, I think we all have ideas about how our local government, state government, and federal government could have, or have, or haven't done things that would have facilitated a slowing of the spread, or better information about. I mean, there are plenty of ways that we can all think of, I would think, to criticize public health practices and policies in this. rather than laying it entirely at the feet of the body, the individual body.
The feet of the body. I like that.
I believe Lori has a question, and Linda.
Yes, my question goes back to something Cheryl said, something you said, Anna, and something Laura said. The difference is that, well, you pointed out early on in one of your slides about the conditions, the overcrowding, the sanitation. Those were some of the factors that influenced the spread at that early plague. And Laura, you you talked about the belief that when people came over, that the Spanish Mexican population were somehow more to blame themselves for whatever reasons. And Cheryl, you brought up an interesting point, which this is really the question. Is there any evidence that diet contributed to those who, I mean, if there was I think Laura was one who said somebody said there was an 80% fatality among the group. Is there any evidence that in fact the European diet, which was, you described it as heavy in meats and so on, versus the agricultural diet, is there a significant difference in how those peoples handled the plague? For all of you, that's the question.
I don't think there is any evidence about it. That was just the Spanish explanation. I mean, it was so prevalent in the 1500s to explain personalities and personality types by country because of the stars overhead and the food that went in. And so they just fell back on those two explanations that, living, particularly once you get below the equator, that had all kinds of ramifications for, I mean, men turned to women Spanish men turned into women if they moved south of the equator. So I haven't heard of anything that actually documents diet, vegetarian versus meat diet, as being at the root cause of that. It was all an immunoreaction,
Mm-hmm. Okay.
immunological.
Lori, I know that in the ancient Greek context, the epidemic was actually studied. There's a famous Hippocratic text called Epidemics. And the way that the ancient Greek medical writers explained vulnerability to epidemic was by geographical location, which they thought determined the kind of body that you had. So whatever waters you're drinking, whatever air you're exposed to, your proximity to a sea, or your altitude, they thought that those kind of factors determined in part the nature of your body, and therefore the degree of vulnerability that you had to an epidemic. But they also thought that diet, right, that people who had better diets, right, were better equipped to weather the ravages of disease.
And how did they define better diets?
This is where we go back to that old story of the humors. When you think of the kind of what ended up being the Galenic picture of the body defined by a balance, health defined as balance of the humors, the ancient Greeks had something like that in mind, right? Is your black bile being balanced by your yellow bile? And shouldn't you have some more honey in your diet so as to realign that balance?
And the New World peoples had the same hot cold system too for foods.
Yeah, I think the Galenic picture of health persisted for a very long time. I think Linda had a question, and then Phoebe.
Okay. This is a little amorphous. Think chicken plant workers. So it's definitely their behavior, but it's coerced behavior. They're not choosing out of their own idiocy to engage in the dangerous behavior. It's, starve to death, go homeless, or take this other risk of getting COVID-19. And that's because of our class system. So when you started talking about ancient Greece or the colonial system, I thought you were going to pull the class system into it more.
Linda,
so I'd like to hear a little more about that.
I mean, Linda, I'm being a little bit speculative here because there isn't good evidence for this, but it's probably the case that the people who were disproportionately affected by the plague in Athens were the farmers who were living on the outskirts of the city in that temporary housing. And yes, I mean, the war was being prosecuted in a way that was probably more beneficial for certain people in Athens, right? Certain people, Athens was a colonial power, and certain people stood to gain more wealth through Athens' colonial expeditions. It was not the farmers, yet it was the farmers who were dying when they're withdrawn into the city during the plague. So yes, I mean, I definitely think that you can give a colonial, that you can think of this as in terms of class.
May I say something? I don't know whether you've all had an opportunity to read the book Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, but I have to tell you, it's one of the most thought-provoking, clear books I've ever read in my life. And it speaks so much. I mean, we have a caste system in this country. You can call it whatever you want, but we do have, by color and such. And of course, a lot of the people, as you say, the poor people are so disproportionately affected, some because of their own choices and actions, some because of what is thrust upon them, and some because they have to go to work and have no other choice, as you were speaking about, So, I think I'm a nurse, but I'm also a doctor of naturopathy, retired from both, but just treat family and friends kind of thing now. But it is, I mean, there's such disproportionate for all sorts of reasons, but anyways, I just wanted to mention that.
Brian had his hand up earlier, I think.
Thank you, Laura and Anna, for this plague perspective over geographical areas of which I did not know, and also differing epochs. But it reminds me of Dr. Dorsey Armstrong of Purdue University, who put on a great courses show about the Black Plague in about 23 or 24 series episodes. And also it brings to mind Albert Camus' book, The Plague, novel. But what is striking, is so striking to me, has to do with the reaction of the victims across all those ages and geographic areas. Human nature is such that it was consistent, the reactions to all of this, exactly what the two of you have described in the plague, in these other works that I mentioned. So thank you very much. I appreciate that it was revealing. Good, thank you.
Brian, if I can ask a follow-up, I mean, I think, do you mean that human nature is consistent in its reaction to plague in the sense that there's a kind of breakdown of order? Or I think, as Laura was sort of suggesting, there's a breakdown and a rebuilding of a new order?
Actually, both. Licentiousness, denial, lawlessness, all of that prevailed in, for example, the 1340s in Europe, but also in Iran, Algiers, as described by Albert Camus. But it did all lead to a different social order. For example, in Europe, Dr. Armstrong pointed out that serfdom was the prevailing social order of work prior to the plague, which left so few workers as who survived as to change from sort of a slavery serfdom workforce to people who could, in fact, have upward social and economic mobility. So,
thanks, Brian. I mean, I guess I would say the scholar I mentioned, there is the going view among scholars is that plague is what expedited the demise of the democratic institution, right? Which is fascinating. I would like to think through that a little bit more, especially because of the moment we're in now, right? But yes, I think you're importantly pointing out that there seems to be a consistent pattern in, if you study the history of plagues, which is that major social institutions are ended by it. Roland, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's true.
We might be experiencing a little bit of caste or class activity right now in Congress, because the reason that bill to provide some relief is not moving forward is because Mitch McConnell is insisting that it's got to have a provision to exempt employers from lawsuits over negligent practices. And so that's a little bit of a class thing going on right now.
Yep. And it connects directly to that chicken processing plant issue where,
exactly.
Yeah. And just a case of treatment. I mean, this has been true. I don't know about Athens, but I feel pretty confident in the last 1,000 years that the wealthier you are, the less likely you are to get the plague, and the more likely you are to get the best treatment for it, should you get it, whatever the state of the art of the treatment is. Pope was hiding in Avignon in 1346 and stayed in a room that was basically completely sealed off from everything. People slid food into him, and he just, I mean, there wasn't a lot of healthcare then, but he did do something that actually protected him. And he kind of bathed, and that bathing was not a thing, right? But he kept himself clean, all of which we know now is extraordinarily important for good health. But your average serf who's dying out there and passing it on to their entire family. And some scholars of the Black Death think that some of the deaths that were the result of the plague came because so many people in an area died, there was no one who knew how to get wheat into flour left alive, right? That they were too young to have actually learned how to do that. And so they perished because they couldn't produce enough kinds of food to not die of famine and malnutrition. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, class is always underlying part of what's happening here.
Another thing that happened in the New World, the first epidemic was prior to 1519 when Cortez showed up, because the Spanish had been in the Caribbean as early as 1492. So the different diseases, epidemics were traveling with the Spanish trade goods to native populations that hadn't yet laid eyes on a Spaniard. So these epidemics preceded the Spanish, but between 1519 in Mexico City and 1602 in Mexico City, there were there was a major die-off almost every 5 years. And one of the problems with healthcare delivery at that time period was that the cause was different. In plague after plague after plague, it was salmonella, it was smallpox, it was typhoid, it was typhus. I mean, the litany of all the different diseases that hit in that century alone would make it almost impossible to try to recognize symptoms, deliver health care, and living apart. Low density is certainly a solution, but the irony is that throughout that century, the Spanish were increasingly congregating the natives so that they could be more easily ministered to, both for healthcare reasons and for religious reasons. But that moving target of all those different sources of epidemics was also very instrumental in the up to 90% death rate in Mexico in the first century.
I do have a question for Laura, which is there any discussion in the period you're talking about of the effects on doctors and medical practitioners?
Not I think like you, well, not so much. I don't, that I am aware of, but that doesn't mean there isn't some literature on it. But I think that part of the problem is how little access we have. I mean, just talking about the Florentine Codex, which is written over a large part of the 16th century and gives us a bunch of information, is still not interested in providing those kinds of details. And we don't have access to things like journals or letters until a century later that would fill in some of those blanks. And by then we wouldn't have any information about indigenous practitioners.
Mm-hmm.
Just the idea that, the doctors are the firemen who run into the burning building while everyone else is running out. Mm-hmm. It would have killed off a lot of the medical practitioners. And that has been documented further north in what is now the United States, with the healers wiped out. Mm-hmm. You no longer have anybody who even knows how to take care of the usual problems. Mm-hmm. And as with COVID-19, you have more people dying of the other usual causes because the doctors are distracted, or, our unaccountable death rate in the United States is well over 300,000, 350,000 dead, unexpected, unaccounted for, way off average deaths. So that would have been part of what's going on in both cases as well, especially where the indigenous case was going on.
It's striking that Thucydides tells us that the one of the populations that was most affected by the plague were the doctors and those that were administering to the sick, that they died in huge numbers. And what you see in his discussion then is that to the extent that the city responded at all to the plague, it responded through medical practitioners, right, who were dying in huge numbers.
Again, kind of like now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. But I thought this during Phoebe's talk a while ago too, that I'm not sure I find the remarkable consistency of humans in these circumstances as comforting. That we are not able to, and I suppose it's still my own kind of dying belief in progress, slowly, and my humanism all over there in the embers, that human beings cannot seem to get past these particular kinds of public health, common good related circumstances to care for one another. I mean, from Anna through now, there's just no, there's no evidence that we've actually gotten better at dealing with this, even though we have all kinds of other ways of dealing with it.
Phoebe,
Yeah,
did you-
I just want to say, Lord, that's exactly right. Our strides in public health have been clean water, sewage, immunizations, not human behavior so much.
A new place to focus. And yet there are the countries, South Korea, Australia, Singapore, Taiwan, most of the Pacific Islands, where they have, I did a lifelong learners thing where I did my research at the end of October, and I finally sent out the promised notes, and I did some additional research before I did that, only to learn that one of the countries that was doing so well at the end of October had one additional death as of last week. Another of the countries that was doing so well had 0 additional deaths as of last week from the end of October. And it's not human nature, it's specific cultures. We're talking about a colonial situation. We're talking about a warrior state. And then we're comparing them with us. We're comparing the worst with the worst and then calling it human nature. But if we look at Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, the mask wearing cultures, Japan, it's flu season. Everybody was already wearing masks all flu season long in those places, or well, maybe not in Australia. And another thing about Australia, they have the same taking over a continent from the indigenous people, gun-toting cowboy culture, frontier, descended from the British culture. They're essentially us with a minor tweak of difference, and yet they've been able to pull it off and protect their people. So I'm going to say it's not human nature. We don't have to be doing it this way.
Linda, you make a forceful argument. I'm going to have to, I was on board with Brian's view earlier that this is a historical pattern that we can't escape, but I'm going to have to rethink that.
Yeah, maybe.
Brian, yes.
One of the ramifications of the huge die-off of native peoples in the Caribbean and Mexico by 1566 is lack of labor. So that's when they start importing Africans.
Oh, Africa. Yeah.
So, plagues have these, the end of democracy in Athens and the beginning of slavery in the New World, Black African slavery in the New World. I mean, there are these major things that happen as a result of like Shakespeare writing.
I think Brian wanted to respond.
Yes, 2 things. My comment about human nature related to humans' reactions to the coming plague, the impending calamity that was cascading upon them. But in response to Linda's comment, I believe that it was the city government in Milan and the city government in Salzburg locked the gates, placed soldiers at all the entrances to the walled cities, and prevented anyone from coming in or going out. Now, I'm unsure as to how they imported foodstuffs to support their populations. A little vague on that. However, in both of those cities, there was very little plague fostered on the population, but it was due in that case to the city government taking very forceful militant action to prevent the importation of the pestilence. But the people in all the other places, it's just was sort of astounding to me, the how they reacted to that coming calamity.
Are you saying then, in other words, to Linda, that it's not the different culture among people in Australia or South Korea that's doing the work here, but rather a government that, I don't want to call it authoritarian, but that can enact a strong state-centered response? That's what's doing the work, not culture.
Mm-hmm. I think that has to be a role. The willingness to put teeth in penalties for not behaving for the common good, which is not, it's just not an American thing. Culturally there, I just think we as a nation are unwilling to sacrifice however it is we want to define freedom for something else, without entering the military or some other kind of structured shape of our identity.
Linda, I think you want to respond.
Going back to my research and my previous lifelong learners course,
which was on disaster.
Which was on disaster response, and only the last of my 6 sessions was on the current COVID situation. But I used to be a cultural anthropologist who studied comparative religion until one day I found myself in the middle of a month-long flood in Fargo, North Dakota. And to keep from going crazy, I started taking notes and recording things and doing interviews. And I studied how they could perform miracles that I would not have believed possible by organizing the people there to give up their normal, everyday American culture for months at a time, because it's so flat there, the water rises and it doesn't flow away for over a month. The record flood in 2011 lasted from April till June. And they're like bicultural up there. They go into flood mode. They become a working communist communal dining. The entire city works to sandbag one another, to place the pumps to keep the water flowing in and flowing out in the right direction. They feed one another. They share everything. They stop going to work. They stop being selfish. Businesses that are not essential use their employees to organize everybody helping rather than going to work. They sandbag one another at their business, and then they go join the general sandbag things. They are capable of doing that. It's the most miraculous. I never would have thought it possible. I have witnessed it. I have participated in it. And they've done it twice since the flood that I was in 1997. And yet, one of the reasons it took me over a month to get my notes out to my class, when I researched, well, okay, how is Fargo doing now? With this, they must be doing great. The guy who was deputy mayor during all the flood fights is now the mayor, and he's a surgeon. Well, we all know that at one point, North Dakota was the most infected nation in the world.
Mm-hmm.
They refused to wear masks. They did not participate. They were, liberate Michigan. They were ready to invade neighboring states to free Minnesota from their mask requirements. I'm still trying to figure this out. These people who sacrificed the American selfish culture. I mean, they even had a bicultural religion that when they went into flood mode, they also went into flood religion. And among other things, God never punished them with the floods. They were quite clear on that at every church. God honored them by sending help. God organized the Red Cross. God organized the flood fighters, the sandbaggers, the people cooking at home to take it down to the Red Cross distribution place to get hot food to the sandbaggers every day. That was God's part. And I keep waiting for some religion in this country to say, God is not punishing us. God is sending all those medical workers. Please honor them by wearing a mask and make it easier on them. I've
Well,
seen
Reverend,
what people can do. I don't know why we're not doing it. And you're helping explain to me why we're not doing it. But even Fargo, where they are capable of miraculous, they are bicultural up there. And I thought, oh, Fargo's going to go into disaster mode. It's going to be the safest place in the country during COVID-19. It was one of the absolute worst. However, it was Fargo with their surgeon mayor who helped organize the flood fights. It was his mask order in Fargo that within 2 weeks had so much of a result in reducing transmission that was when the governor finally put in the North Dakota mask order, even though he's a hardcore Republican.
Joanne, did you? Joanne, I saw Joanne.
No, I was just going to ask Linda, do you have any concept as to why? You know, having been there and known the people and lived with the people, do you have any concept as to why that
I
happened?
can explain why they could do the flood fighting. They were pretty much mono-ethnic. You know, they don't have Black people in Fargo, North Dakota. They really don't. They have a Native American minority who live in slums, which are closest to the river. And yet people are so proud of their flood fighting ability that even the people who don't like Indians will be out sandbagging the Indians' neighborhoods because that's what they do. It's their value system. So first of all, they have floods often enough that every generation remembers the floods. They have a local identity that we are the flood fighters. I mean, I would go to interview people who lived along the river and they would say, oh, you've got to go to my grandmother's house. They have the flood photo albums from the Great Flood of 1950. So A, it happens often enough that they stay in practice. B, it's a cultural identity thing. I think also most of the people moving to Fargo come from the countryside where they have a rural small town identity. So the neighborhoods are pre-organized like small towns around their schools and churches so that the neighborhood can organize itself to do the flood fighting. When the city government starts delivering the sandbags, they know how to organize getting them put in the right place. They have no practice with pandemics. And so even though the flood fighting mayor, who is the surgeon, said, okay, everybody, we've got to do our part like we always do. One of the health department people that I interviewed during the previous floods, I mean, they, in the all-time record flood, they organized the evacuation of the hospitals, the nursing homes, and the group homes to small towns, even in neighboring states, to get them far enough away to be away from the water. One of the people who organized that is now the head of the health department there. When I saw her doing the normal State of the City address like they do for every flood, she was doing a State of the City address for COVID. I thought, they've got this. And they didn't. it's not their tradition to fight pandemics. It's their tradition to be bicultural when it comes to fighting floods. But
Do
I
you
thought
think
more
they-
would carry over. We respond to disaster. Apparently they just respond to only one kind.
Do you think they feel is that they're being told this from outside rather than within their core community?
No,
it
because of who is the mayor and Desiree Fleming, who's so familiar from organizing, you saved my grandmother when her nursing home was on the verge of going under. They are familiar people
Okay.
who are rebelled against. I don't know why.
Mm-mm.
I guess I need to go up and interview people.
It's a fascinating project.
Yeah.
So,
Too bad you can't go interview the people from Athens and Mexico City, Tenochtitlan.
well, thank the two of you and all of you who attended and participated.
Thank
and have a good holiday, safe holiday, and we'll start up again the 6th of January. I'll be sending out announcements
Thank
about 10 days before.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
Thank you,
so much.
Cheryl, for organizing.
Sure.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.